Yeah, so it was a lot of big words, right, throughout that entire introduction. So to kind of simplify it, I'm an online community architect. It's my job to build spaces where people can connect for peer-to-peer discussions and then get comfortable over time self-disclosing and connecting with who they are. So most of my time I started in the LGBTQIA community, just building online community there. And I ended up with this community I didn't know how to run. So I went to school and I'm like, university, please help me. We don't have any clue. So I ended up doing a whole bunch of research and studies in order to ensure that I understood how these online communities are built in spaces. And that's kind of where I come from in this DEI and social science perspective for building online communities.
There we go. Found my unmute button. I absolutely love that. And thank you so much for kind of breaking that down for us. Thank you also to our community members. I'm seeing people chime in the chat thread with where they're joining us from. So thank you for sharing. I'm always so excited to see how far our global audience spreads on these events.
Des Moines, I was just there.
I know, isn't this bonkers? I love this. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about, when you're talking about things like measuring community health, how is that different from measuring marketing data? If people don't really have a good grasp of the differences, what are the main ones?
A great question. The really important difference between marketing and online community is that marketing can occur on multiple different fronts having to do with your own company. And you hear this all the time in marketing. Marketing is a scaled up conversation with your customer. So you have this funnel where people say, hey, I'm raising my hand because I have an interest in this lead magnet and this small little thing. And then you say, okay, great, that sounds awesome. Why don't we provide you some blogs so that you can understand who we are? And then they say, great, I read the blogs, I'm super interested. Can I come to a webinar? And you're like, yep, webinar, great, let's have this conversation. And as they get closer and closer into that funnel, you're having this conversation with them that brings them in further to your brand. Community is them talking to other people in that way. And you don't get control over that. That's not a funnel that you're allowed to build or construct for their interactions with other people. But you can facilitate that interaction. You can facilitate that connection. So with marketing, it's a conversation between you and your customer. With community, it's a conversation between all the different stakeholders in your online community with each other. You're removed from that circumstance. And that kind of changes the way that you have to build an online community. A lot of people like to say the community manager's job is to herd cats. We say, hey, we have this thing. Do you want to come to it? And they're like, nah, but you know what we're super interested in is this thing.
That weird thing you're not promoting and wasn't on your radar. And now you're like, oh, okay, that's what you like. All right, well.
Exactly. And it's like this community co-creation that occurs that creates peer-to-peer involvement. So
I think that's,
if you want to build a,
No, I love how you broke that down about the differences between like whether you're trying to gather information on a product versus gather information on how your customers are relating to each other as opposed to the product.
Exactly. And I think that's what a lot of people miss. When you hear from community managers, an audience is not a community, that's what they mean. You can have a whole bunch of people listening to you in any given way, but if they're not talking to one another, you don't have a community, you have an audience. And you can galvanize an audience into a community for sure, but it requires those quality interactions and those talking points.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense. Think about, some people, you might be a music fan of several different artists, but, there's a big difference between somebody who, I like Taylor Swift versus a diehard Swiftie. That there's a massive difference there between whether someone is part of a community or is, experiencing this as a product as opposed to an environment.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good point, because a lot of people tend to struggle with this concept of like, all right, what's the difference here? What's going on? And you mentioned Taylor Swift. A lot of creators have what we call stadium communities. So if you think of football or you think of soccer, you can have your favorite team and you can celebrate and you can go into your own house. You all watch the game. You all divide each other by color-coded like shirts. This is signography. This is representation that says, this is who I am supporting. And that's not a discussion that you're having with the football players. It's a discussion you're having with your friends and your family. So stadium communities are communities by virtue of the fact that people come together around the things that they love. That's not the same thing as when you're an influencer and you're all watching on YouTube and the chat's turned off, you're all engaging in that content. That's not a community feature. But the community feature is when you say, hey, are you going to go to the game on Saturday?
I think it's kind of the difference between like posting a video to Facebook versus going on Facebook Live, right? You have the option. Obviously, you don't have to have comments open while you're live, but that does make it takes it from less of a content piece and makes it into that interactive event or environment that that your community members can come together around.
Exactly.
I like that. All right. So just when we're talking about that community health data, what can that tell us? Like if you are, I think there's certain things that people think of in marketing as like metrics that you track or things that are important to follow. But when it comes to community health data, what are some of the benefits that you can get from it?
Yeah. A really important question that kind of opens up a little bit of a miasma, but I hope that the people in the chat who are involved with community are going to breathe a sigh of relief hearing this. Before I can answer anything about community metric value as it pertains to marketing or to ROI, I have to say this very clearly. Community is a social scientific thing. It needs to be measured social scientifically. It's a phenomenon. It's a culture. Our job is to build spaces where cultures can build, and then we have to be able to measure that culture the way we measure culture, which is with social science, right?
That's huge. That's a huge thing right there. Like you're talking about measure the things in the units that matter, as opposed to we're going to measure the community health in terms of how it affects our bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. So what I mean, kind of delving deep into this, when it comes to measuring online community, what a lot of people make the mistake of, and I fully support doing this if you're at the very, very, very beginning of your community, because measurement is a muscle. You start with what you know. One of the most important things about engagement scores, like my community is getting bigger and I have newcomers coming in and my onboarding paths are working really well. And all of these engagements are leading me to like this follower count on a smaller community level, right? And then you realize that a large majority of the people are joining and then they're getting the lead magnet that you asked them to join for, and then they're not engaging any further. And if you look at your fall off chart, they're gone within 1 or 2 weeks maybe, and then trying to reactivate them isn't really working. And the reason for that is because your raw engagement number that comes in is super, super important in marketing. That's your funnel, right? And you need to pay attention to that. But most community metrics are about quality, not quantity. Instead of measuring how many people are coming to your webinar, you need to be using something like a net promoter score. There's a lot of problems with the net promoter score, but you need to have an event-specific net promoter score that says, did you receive value? And ask them to parrot that value back to you. Just say, hey, on this scale, NPS, how was the event? Great. Can you give us one statement for what you think was really great? What was the big takeaway that you took? And then you can use that information on one hand for social proof. Great, your marketing team is super, super happy now. But on the other hand, you now have the ability to say, this is why this event impacted someone. Can we create something community involved to make this happen elsewhere? So one example could be if you're running a webinar and that webinar is, say, how to get a job, right? You go through the process of here's how to develop a resume, here's how to develop a cover letter, et cetera. And then at the end of it, everyone's like, this was really, really great information. I'm still struggling emotionally with whether or not I'm ready to write that cover letter for X awesome company, right? So you're like, oh, okay, so we got this amazing feedback. We're going to launch a workshop now that breaks people down into small groups that focus on each paragraph of the cover letter. How do you nail that intro? Now, how do you nail that historical review? How do you nail your passion statement? And then once you have these specific small groups, now these small groups are communicating, they're talking to one another, they're talking about their own successes. And at the end of that workshop, you say, okay, great. So we've all worked on this cover letter. Let's share it out. And also let's make a promise before we leave here. In 1 week, we're going to come back and state whether or not we are still happy with the cover letter that we wrote and what we changed. And that commits everyone to say, hey, we are going to make this a long-term development path. And it makes sure that they come back a week later to engage in their community.
I love that. I like the idea of making it not necessarily building a habit out of it, but making it something that is a life cycle as opposed to start and finish, right? Exactly. It's, you know, getting butts in the door, or, like butts in seats is valuable, but that's not a great way to evaluate the success of a community space. Exactly. We have a lot of people in here saying the same thing. Like, they loved your distinction between community and marketing. Suleika had asked, how do you measure with social science? Could you expand on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I actually have quite a few different ways, but I'm going to give you the easiest possible way that you could do it. I don't care what BI system you use or what dashboarding system you use, whatever it is, port in a simple spreadsheet that has comments that happened in your community. So it's like a journal, just like, hey, I absolutely loved this. And you're like, great, that was a Google review. And I'm going to paste the actual comment. And then you're going to have a column for disposition. If it's positive, put a 1. If it's negative, put a 0. And then once you have these positive and negative dispositions with comments going down and you have a source for where they are, that was 4 columns in a spreadsheet, right? Now you can port that into any BI system. I use Data Studio, Looker Studio now. And you just separate your positives and your negatives for any given week. And now you have something called the kudos and the uh-ohs. 5 kudos.
I love that pairing.
And then 5
kudos we use, but I love the uh-ohs. That's awesome.
Yeah. So once you have this document down, you have now built for yourself what we in social science tend to call a field journal. So that field journal is essentially what happened, where did it happen, was it good or bad, and now you can start adding tags to it. And once you have these tags, what you're doing is you are taking some social scientific steps that the numbers people, the data people, the marketing people, they get to skip this, because numbers is about abstracting behavior. So X number of people walked on this beach, leaving X number of footprints. We know that information, but we don't know anything about who those people are. We have to abstract information that says this is a 6-foot footprint. In social science, the layers of abstraction necessary for you to capture data are longer. You have to collect the information and then say, is this positive or negative? Great. Where is it from? Google, Twitter, Facebook, where is it from? And then you add layers of abstraction such as, is this about our payment system? Or is it about our online community? Or did we not deliver well? What is this message? And once you've started to add tags or labels to specific qualitative data, you'll start to see patterns. And I'm going to give you another one of my phrases. Truth is in the trend, power is in the pattern. As you start to see certain tags coming up with negative or positive dispositions, you know what you're doing well and what you're not. You know exactly why it's not happening. And you can use social science in order to play around with that information. And to make this easier, this is where it kind of comes in, I'll actually give you a scientific framework for you to apply called social currency, right? Are we able to go into this? I don't want to run out of time.
Yeah, no, we're good. We've got 15 minutes left and a ton of questions, but we're kind of taking chips away at a lot of them. So yeah, no, this is great. Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. So social currency, social capital, it's this woo kind of thing in the title, or it's like, what is this thing, right? So social capital is a social framework that you can use in order to tag that qualitative data that I was talking about. Essentially what it is before any money changes hands, Meg, if you want to purchase something from me, right, you need to trust me before you purchase the thing from me, right? So before any amount of money changes hands, you are making some snap decisions and lending me what we call social capital. And that social capital is saying, do I trust this person? Are they being transparent enough? Are they hiding something? Is this actually useful? Have they mentioned that there's utility here? Do I believe that if I purchase this thing, they will remain where they are? Are they consistent for me to come back and buy again? What about the merit? Is it a high quality product, a high quality service being offered? These kinds of things, these small little tokens of social capital are being exchanged between the two of us before you ever purchase a thing. Those are measurable. You can measure those things. There's a lot of concern and complexity for being able to measure trust in online communities, but it is truthfully very, very important. So what social currency does is it says, going back to that spreadsheet, I have this comment that says, your services are absolutely incredible, but when you sent Brad to my door in order to take care of this chore that I had, he was a little bit rude. He was kind of tact, but he did get the job done and it was done very well. Thank you for fixing my fence. So that small amount of feedback, it's about Brad, but there's also benefits, like the utility was pretty high. The transparency was very low. The merit was pretty low. And when you use these tags, as you start tagging these comments, you'll start to see trends and patterns arise that tell people, we think that your business or your brand or your work is highly transparent and it's highly useful, but we would really like to see more of this. And then you can take that and you can say, all right, well, let's go do that then.
Well, yeah, because you're not only getting feedback on some things to improve, but you're also getting feedback on, hey, we appreciate the way this is going. So you do have that kind of like 2-for-1 kind of mentality. It's not all bad. It's not, there's good things they like about it. But yeah, you're getting that feedback in ways that are helpful for multiple things, because instead of just silence and you're like, okay, well, if nobody's complaining about it, then, it must be okay. It kind of also helps you to narrow in and say like, no, they're good with this. Don't change it. Don't mess with what's working on this, in this area.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when it comes to that forecasting and benchmarking, is there anything else that we should know about that in terms of how we're measuring the community health?
Yeah. So in order for you to benchmark and forecast something, it must remain the same, but communities don't usually do that, which is why you need a framework. And I use the social currency framework because virtually any conversation is going to result in some transaction of social capital having occurred, right? One of the important things about benchmarking, because truth is in the trend, power is in the pattern, you have to identify your patterns first and then explore them over time. The really important thing about social science is that social science exists because traditional science, the scientific method you were taught about in 6th grade, it is insufficient for studying community. A lot of people think it's the opposite. A lot of people are like, oh, social science, it's not scientific because it doesn't apply to the method. And it's like, well, no, we had to augment the scientific method to make it a scientific process. And one of the main ways that we did that was by making it one big longitudinal study where all past data applies to the current experiment at all times. So when you have past data and you see a pattern, you need to go back to confirm that pattern with past data and then forecast your future data. And then once you, like quarter 2, you do this review of past data. And then quarter 3, you notice something new has happened and you go, oh, was that happening before? And then you go back and you figure out whether or not it happened before, and then you track it over time. Forecasting and benchmarking are 2 parts of the same coin. They're not 2 separate operations.
Ooh, I like that. I very much like that distinction. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about how we should be classifying traffic when you are measuring things like community health. I'm going to step back because I think this is a big subject. So how would you answer this question?
I'm going to make the marketers happy. Community managers find this immensely difficult for a variety of different reasons. So when a community manager is like, how am I going to measure my online community health if all marketers are giving me is a bunch of basic numbers of things that happened, not people's dispositions or how they feel about the way those things happened? Because you can't measure communication happening between 2 peer members when you're not a part of that discussion. So the marketer's path to measuring that is to come in and be like, hey, I want to be a part of this discussion. People get a little bit weirded out. People get creeped out by that. And community managers are like, you need to stop, right? In order to measure online community health, the easy way is to just go back to using UTM trackers, which a lot of marketers are already going to be familiar with, and just create one simple community tracker called Community Generated Lead, CGL. Put that into UTM source. So where did this lead come from? It is a source of community generated lead. Awesome. What's the medium? The platform that you're on is going to have a lot of differences kind of coming through. And then your medium, your like campaign or whatever, just make it CGL. You don't need to know all the information about it. All marketers want to know is that a conversation happened, it came through, and it was a community generated lead. Problem solved. Now, there are more advanced ways to do this too. And this is where I'm going to bring in another suite of tools that I highly recommend, which are called community intelligence platforms. So community intelligence platforms are essentially everything that we've talked about. Sounds kind of difficult. Just get a community intelligence platform and it will do all of the things that I was talking to you about out of the box. That's what these platforms were built for. I love Common Room. Orbit is really good as if you're in a more technical community space, but get yourself a community intelligence platform to help you measure these things. Because we've done a lot of work and we've talked about like, what are the failings of a lot of CRMs? How can we fix that? And that's exactly what this suite of products is for.
Cool. Very excellent. All right. So if we are selecting KPIs based on industry standards, and we, as we just talked about, that does not work. How should we go about selecting what matters, especially week over week?
Yeah. So kind of going back to that same benchmarking discussion, in order to really pick what matters week over week, don't try to do all of the things. All community, I don't care what role you have as a community builder, or even if you just have community builders on your team you need to work with, knowing this is going to make things way easier for you. All community boils down to two things. You are trying to set a precedent. We've done a little bit of research and we believe that this would be healthier for the online community or for the brand, and then set momentum for that precedent. We're going to build this from our super users into our general users into our newcomers. You're setting the precedent to do a thing, and then you are building momentum until that thing is no longer your job. The community is doing it on their own. And then you go and you build the next precedent. So what I recommend when it comes to figuring out what specific metrics you want, decide for each quarter what 2 things you want to do for your community. And every 6 months, do a review of that. And what I recommend is having 3 dashboards. The first one is for the executive team. It's community ROI. We'll ignore it for the purposes of this conversation. The second dashboard is the one that I want you to focus on, setting precedent and building momentum. Just a nice little line down your dashboard, the goal that you are attempting to set, and then your primary KPI for it, and then a link to a report that says, we looked through the data, here's how it worked after a quarter or so. And then that frees you up for a third dashboard, which is all about the community pulse point, which is those kudos and uh-ohs, those engagement metrics, all of the things that are about community culture that you're not directly impacting can go onto that third dashboard. And you just have one dedicated dashboard that says, what is your team looking to do? And did they achieve it?
I love that. I love the idea of, trying to, you're going to have to gather a lot of disparate and information from all over. And I like the idea of having some place to come back to it and be like, no, this is how we're going to center ourselves. Like, we need to know all of these things. When it comes to accuracy, when it comes to record keeping, like accuracy is big, but how accurate do people really need to be? How granular, do they need to dive in on this kind of stuff?
Oh, this is the metrics obsession question. Okay, I get this question a lot. John O'Bacon is another community specialist in the space, and he's really, really known for saying, we don't need to track all of the things that we are tracking, and he's right. At a certain point in time, teams end up metrics obsessed because they feel like they need to measure all of the things. But in social science, you're actually taught that the correlation to causation problem isn't an issue unless you're actually ready to publish your work. Don't worry about it until the point it ends up on a white paper. And for us in community management and in corporate, we're never going to get there. So why are we focusing on that much level of accuracy? The reality is, instead of trying to do something that is so causational that it cannot be broken, just do the correlational thing over and over and over again. Like I said, with benchmarking and forecasting, it's the same experiment over time. And you're checking back and going, did this happen? Is it happening? What changed? Did this happen? Is it happening? What changed? And as you go through, you are repeating an imperfect experiment over and over and over and over again. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have this huge high resolution for your online community. Just do an imperfect thing enough times that you reach what in social science we call saturation rate. 60% of the data is coming in completely useless because you already have the same result. You're not learning anything new. And at that point in time, you've reached causation because it's what's happening. Nothing new is occurring that you don't expect.
Yeah. I can't tell you how unexpectedly like passionate like I now have learned that I am about community data. Like this is so wonderful to get to hear you break these things down. We only have 2 minutes left. So the last thing I want to talk about, you mentioned it, but the idea of correlation versus causation. Do people need to worry about it?
Like I said, for the same reason as forecasting and benchmarking, do not work on causation. The way that I recommend this is if you ask a question and it is not answerable by your current data set, you have to ask yourself one of two things. Is the question important for us to know? So important that we are willing to change our dashboards? And second, can we derive the answer from our current system? If it can be derived and it is important, then yes, get more specific. But if not, don't worry about it. Just go ask your community members. Hey, this is a really interesting question. What are your ideas? What are your reports? And then just toss that into your field journal. You'll have a good enough answer to operate your community.
Love that. Okay. All right, Venia, it's been wonderful to get to sit here and talk to you. Is there anything that you want to leave our audience members with? If they only take one thing, like what should they remember?
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of really complex topics, a lot of really social scientific principles and stuff like that. So if you are interested in community, you don't need a degree to be a community manager, but knowing these concepts is really, really helpful. I'm more than happy to have these conversations. So like, just join our communities and we'd be more than happy to talk more about all of these topics in these sessions. And I'm just really, really happy that I was able to come here and nerd out about the social science and community with all of you.
Yes, of course. Again, thank you so much, Venia, and we cannot wait to speak with you again in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.